Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is a show where you can have your property related questions answered by our team of experts. And joining me today is Zee Razaq, Managing Director of Surtax Accounting from St Albans. Welcome to you, Zee. Good to see you back again.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
And Vivek Brahmbhatt, Property Agent, Consultant and Partner for Robinson Marsh. So good to see you back.
Pleasure, thank you again.
So we didn't frighten you off with our first programme?
No, you've managed to, you can't get rid of me now.
Right, okay, well that sounds okay to me. You have good knowledge of both the area and the industry, so that's always useful to everybody. Okay, Zee, we're going to start off with you. With significantly rising interest rates for borrowers in the buy-to-let sector of the market, do the panel envisage a significant rise in property repossessions as the profit margins for landlords narrows? If so, this will continue to increase rents across the country as stock diminishes, will it not?
Good question. I think there's two parts to that. I think one is your current state of play with future interest rates, doing a bit of a stress test or a what if scenario, i.e. what if the interest rates go up, what is that going to affect your profitability? So getting your advisor to help you on that. And I think one of the solutions we're going to find in especially recession times is deleveraging. And I think that's going to become quite important to get the cash flow running, otherwise the property business won't cash flow.
Does that mean you're thinking that people are going to try and get rid of their borrowing to get out of this high interest rate sort of?
I think it depends on their financial situation. I think they're going to reduce how much they borrow, and that's common in recession times if you look at last few recessions, and I think you'll be well versed on those with your knowledge and experience on those.
Do you mean I'm getting old now, so I've seen it all before?
Getting wiser.
Seen a few cycles.
No, getting wiser, because you learn, don't you? Because they're very similar. And the second part, I think, is if people are getting a barrier to entry and they can't afford it, the regulations like HMOs, license and things like this, that's got to be looked at, because when you've got lack of supply, you've got to improve it. You've got to incentivize landowners to get involved in the property market. And I think that's the big challenge.
I think one of the things that always concerns me is the effectiveness of people's business planning. And especially with the smaller investor, I mean, you can't blame them. They're not professionals. They are small investors, and they do miss out some critical factors that are going to influence their profit. I mean, we were talking the other day to one of the lenders, and it's quite interesting. So while interest rates were very low and you were borrowing at, say, 2% over base, well, that probably still meant 2.5%. And in cash terms, that's £2 in the 100 or 200 in the 1,000 or whatever it is, or but of course, when you're looking at borrowing at 2% over base and the base has gone up to 5, 6 or 7, the actual cash difference is huge. And if that's not going to be reflected in your rents, you're going to be in trouble.
You've hit the nail on the head. The yield is becoming more important than ever. If you look at a traditional buy-to-let, they're probably getting like a 5%, 6, 7% yield if they're lucky, right? Whereas now they're probably having to look at 10% plus. I think we're speaking off air around this. There's so many challenges, and if they don't factor that in or structure their financing, i.e. their leverage, they're going to find themselves in a lot of hot water.
Well, yes, and especially one of the key things many people forget is to take into account the voids that might occur.
Absolutely.
And again, it's going to hit those margins so hard. It's going to cause catastrophe. And the worry that I have, I mean, you could take the view, couldn't you, if people don't do their due diligence or take the right advice or look into things properly, well, good luck to them. They kind of almost deserve it. But unfortunately, the real recipient of the pain is going to be the renter, isn't it? Because the rents are going to go shooting up and up and up. And when we're talking in London now, Vivek, you're probably going to know better than I, but they were saying that I think the average rent across London now is £2,500 a month.
When you think of it, what it was even sort of back to 2010 to 2012 to just, it might be a bit towards the new build market. If I give you some figures, just for example, a few years back, a good one bed would be, anywhere between 1,300 and 1,500 would be a respectable newly built one bedroom apartment. Right now, you're looking at somewhere between 2 and 2.5K. Again, same sort of square footage in these new build blocks that have been sort of built in the past 12 to 24 months. And so just based on that, that's a basic, like that's an increase of over sort of 25%. So again, in the sort of last 8 years, to have that sort of growth and increase, it's not in line with, you know, everyone's pay, and
It's
that's
almost
where
a
it's being
50%
felt.
increase over what you based.
Sorry, yeah, based on those figures,
Yeah.
over the 8-year period, definitely, it's actually way more than 25. So yeah,
Not looking good.
Question is really important to factor in. What's your rule of thumb on that? Some people say 1 month you should factor in that you might avoid. It depends how quick turnaround you've got from the tenants coming in, preparing the property for the new tenants, and how long you have in your ASD contracts, the short-term tenancy.
And I think one of the other dangers for new sort of buy-to-let people, I'm going to sort of criticise developers here, which I probably shouldn't do, but I will. There are certain developers that will introduce a block to the market at ridiculous low service charge levels to get the sales away. They do it by either cutting services or you know, not actually charging a service charge for the first year, just provide the services. That way they don't get caught up with the paying the flats that are unsold. But you've got to allow that in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, that service charge is going to go through the roof. And again, it's just affecting the margin, isn't it?
That's a big area, especially in cities like London. That becomes a big issue because service charges are probably one of the biggest reasons why landlords leave the market, and especially in recessions where they're feeling the pressure of interest, which is rising, and you've got these service charges, it makes it financially not viable. So you have to factor that in with at least a 5-year plan. And I think that's, if someone minimum looks at a 5-year plan, they'll be in a good sense to see, is this worth investing in this property?
And you know what? There's enough data around, isn't there, to make a good judgment if you look for it.
I think having the right advisor who understands this sector can make a big difference.
Yeah. Okay, Vivek, we're going to move on to your question, which is, with planning regulations being relaxed, reconversion of office space to residential, do the panel think that this really works? Often there's no useful infrastructure like shops, and the local general environment is unsuitable for family life. Very few green spaces, that sort of thing. Does it work?
the short answer is, in some cases, yes. However, I have seen examples where it doesn't work, and a good way to demonstrate that is on light industrial or industrial business parks, where somehow someone has managed to get the consent, obviously under the PD when it was implemented all these years back now, where they have got obviously permission to convert to resi. However, the exterior of the building is one thing, it's still perhaps a bit of an eyesore. That's not so much going to affect, you know, the amenities and, you know, family life. But I think when you're sort of in the middle of like a business park, for example, you're not going to maybe have transport links on your doorstep. You're not going to have a supermarket, a few restaurants, or a handful of amenities on your doorstep. You're probably going to have to walk 10 minutes or drive 5
So
minutes.
we're very lucky down here at Canary Wharf, aren't we?
And that's one of the best things about the Wharf, and even areas like Battersea where they've done something very similar. And the amount of infrastructure that has to be in place, like both of them have more than one station. You know, a lot of residential buildings, jobs created around the area, good transport links. You know, one of the biggest things with Battersea was that it was also categorised as Zone 1. That on its own had a huge uplift on, you know, the marketing capabilities. You're across the road from King's Road, Knightsbridge, Belgravia, Chelsea. So locality is one thing. Yes, of course, it helps. Obviously, that's a slightly different example. But with regard to even areas in Canary Wharf and certain parts of the city, one of my other clients did something in Reading, again, close to the town centre. It was an office block, but it was walking distance to the town centre. They did very well with that block back like sort of 8 years ago now. Again, I think it's individual to each block, and each one needs to be assessed on merit.
But Reading's quite not in its name, but in terms of development, it's quite a new town or city. I'm not quite sure which one it is. Town, I think, isn't it? Even the sort of commercial areas or the industrial areas, a lot of them are high tech units, aren't they? And they've all been built surrounding the city centre. And that's quite useful, isn't it? I mean,
yes, and like
really
the other
works.
benefit with this block, it was actually a gorgeous period property. So they did really well with this one where he got in. They got their units, and within the town centre, whenever you see a John Lewis or a Waitrose, it's sort of always a good sign for investors.
Yeah.
We know that, or just track records
They
shows we can
they know how
get
to
a
do
bit
it,
more
don't
on the margin. Basically, it's a slightly more affluent market, isn't it? And that's what investors look for, those sort of returns. And ultimately, if it helps boost up the GDV figures, that's always a benefit.
Okay, well, there we are, gents. Thank you very much. That's all we've got time for in this half of the show. So join me again after the break when we'll ask Zee and Vivek more of your questions. Welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin, and joining me are Zee Razaq and Vivek Brahmbhatt. So, nice to see you both back after your break. And Zee, your question. Were there any significant changes to the taxation structures in the recent budget that materially affect property investors? Now, I'm not sure. I see in the newspapers today it's all being overturned and changed anyway. So,
I think, where do we start? With the budget especially, and the changes, you have to take them as they happen. And I know it's not a perfect solution because of the changes from the previous mini budget, but we have to just assume that they are going to happen in the timescales they say they're going to do. There's significant changes, so I'm going to try to keep them to the few because there's so many. I think if you look at the journey, and I know we'll go probably in more detail in different episodes, but what you've got to look at is when you buy the property, what's happening, during the journey, what's happening, i.e. what taxes you get hit while you hold it, and then when you sell it, or unfortunately if you pass away. And I think if you look at it that way, you'll start soon seeing what's happening to you is quite detrimental, because the level of taxation is probably the highest since the Second World War, which we were talking about, which is not a good place to be. So from a property investor, let's assume limited companies, right? Corporation tax is increasing. So that's going to affect you holding the property. The stamp duty is minimal benefit on acquisition, but also when you extract money out of the company, and I think that's the bit people get a bit confused by. So important to look at that. That's a personal tax, i.e. dividends is normally the way people extract money out of a company, and that's actually been reducing since 2016, and it's going to get a lot less because you had a allowance, which is going to diminish. It's currently at 2,000. It's actually going to go down to 1,000, then 500, which isn't really great. And if you look back at 2016, it was for the whole basic rate. So that's a big change. So it's the cost of running the business and actually getting money to be able to pay your expenses in life and actually live. It's actually got a lot more cost to run a business from a tax perspective.
Zee, look, one thing puzzles me, and I just struggle with this. I don't want to get too political, but we've had a budget which is effectively the second one in 2 months. I'm at a loss to understand how a new budget that's taken probably 3 to 4 weeks to prepare is suddenly going to make any dramatic difference. I mean, surely don't we have to consider carefully these matters? We've had a government that, whilst they're all very keen to say, oh, well, that was the last government. No, it wasn't the last government. It was the last 12 years of the same government, just with different leaders. That's all. Okay. And, I see in the papers this week that we are the lowest performing economy in geographical Europe other than Russia. And we're about on a par. Now, this to me doesn't ring right. How can we put these things right in 3 or 4 weeks? It's impossible, isn't it? And how are you guys going to advise businesses to be successful in such a climate?
That's a cracking question, and I know we're going to go in proper
Well, nobody's
deep,
written in with that.
deep detail later on this. But overall, the strategy has to be thought about the longer term impacts, and that hasn't been thought about, I believe, over the last 12 years, especially in the last 6 years. You've got different aspects going on, but ultimately the trajectory is that we're not incentivizing entrepreneurs, and that is my biggest issue. In this economy, we're based on entrepreneurs, whether they're property investors, property developers, entrepreneurs running trading businesses, and absolutely. And if
we used to be called a nation of shopkeepers, didn't we? We're now a nation of buy-to-let sort of participants.
Well, I think it's definitely a time for innovation. We've got to attract talent from across the world, which we're trying to do. I know that there's certain trade deals which have made it easier, or immigration laws or legislation that's come in which should help with that, to keep people here after they've finished university, without having to sort of fear about the fear of having to go back to their respective countries, whether it be the US or certain parts of Asia. So I think, again, attracting the best talent globally is what London has always sort of been renowned for. The longer we're able to still, get back to that, the quicker we can do that, the better.
That's a great point, Vivek. I think the supply side, that's what is considered under policies of how much labour we've got coming into the economy, is so crucial. I've got a number of clients who run cleaning businesses, and you're thinking, why is he mentioning cleaning businesses? If you run service accommodation, HMOs, you're likely to hire that or get someone else, outsource that and get that done. If the cost is rising, or you can't get enough labour, then you can't do that no more. And that's what's happening. A lot of cleaning businesses are closing.
See, I've seen here, there's a lot of blocks here, a lot of self-employed cleaners and contract cleaners employed in the various apartments and all the rest of it. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, it was almost like a Romanian suburb to a point, because they were filling huge gaps in the employment market doing these works and doing these contracts and doing it very well. But they've all gone home, and they say, well, we've gone home because we don't feel welcome. We feel like the performance they had to go to register themselves here to stay was so complex, costly and difficult. They don't, no thanks, we're going.
It's been a huge impact. I was speaking to a cleaning company owner, and they're actually going to close down after having the company for a number of years. The number one cited reason is, I can't get the people. And number two is the cost margins, because the cost is rising rapidly to pay them. There's no margin to run the business. And that goes back to the point I made before. You've got to incentivize entrepreneurs. And if we look from a tax perspective and answer that question, what is the tax rate ultimately for an entrepreneur to an employee? Right, and I'm going to base it on a limited company. An employee pays 20% income tax, 12% national insurance in the current system, because it did change. That's 32%. Whereas if I'm an entrepreneur running a limited company, my corporation tax could be 25%, but when you factor in dividend tax, you're looking at 31.5%. So you've gone from being at 25 overall to 31.5, adding those two taxes. Is it really right? An entrepreneur, 0.5% to run a business?
Where's the benefits? Yeah.
And when you're working with people as your main asset, it is just a business with a margin, isn't it?
Absolutely.
What you pay, what you get.
I think with even the fact that you've mentioned, say, a cleaning company or construction companies, like obviously these jobs, to a certain extent, are jobs that people from here, from the UK, or that are born here, are jobs that they don't want to do. And that's why, again, we're seeing these shortages. And, a great example of this is even, maybe we're a little bit stricter with our immigration policies, even off the back of Brexit. Yeah, it's great. But in terms of, for a strong economy, look at Germany. I'm not saying like, let's let everyone in, but at the same time, we need that labour force, like for the hands-on sort of working, whether it's in construction, cleaning, or those sort of labour-intensive, guys on farms picking, crops, is literally what we're here for. To a certain extent, the economy needs that, for growth, for GDP. So it all sort of goes hand in hand. Like you said, why are you talking about cleaners when we're, digressing slightly, but at the same time, it's all interlinked. And without having that infrastructure in place, it sort of stagnates our growth.
You've hit the nail on the head, and hopefully I can just add a little bit to that. The supporting industries to the property market actually stimulate the economy. And I think we're forgetting this. I disagree around Brexit, and that's maybe a political statement, but from a financial perspective, it has not been good for the economy. Look, I'm born here, but my family from somewhere else. So when my father came here, and God bless his soul, he basically came here and worked in the industry of manufacturing. And that's what drove our economy. We need people to replace that as time goes on.
But I mean, the government said this morning, they said it's clear, you can see the huge benefits from Brexit. Well,
Please show me.
Show me, please.
Please enlighten me, because otherwise I don't know, what have we been watching the last 4 years?
I think if you look,
6 years now.
If you look from an economic perspective and what's happening, everyone said that the motivations weren't economic for Brexit. I think that's quite clearly understood, and it's probably put us in a bit of a negative light across the world, from my opinion. We should be a safe pair of hands.
Okay. All right, gents, thank you for that. So, Vivek, your final question. Do the panel think there should be more local authority intervention, read a mix of shop units on high streets, before we're totally overwhelmed with expensive coffee shops?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, we don't want to see empty shops along any high street, whether we're talking Oxford Street, Regent Street, anywhere around areas like Battersea or even Canary Wharf, where there's so much gentrification going on, back to our local towns, like great examples of which would even be areas like Croydon or Ilford, and even parts of West, which, again, there's been a lot of gentrification even around like the Hounslow area. So I think, to answer your question, going forward, there's going to need to be some sort of incentive for the high street to attract new tenants or new brands. And reevaluating or revaluating business rates is going to be a major part of that. Another major factor is going to also be to attract the big brands that, for example, more so at locations such as Oxford Street or Regent Street, which is like super prime central London. Ultimately, London and those two roads in particular are the shopping capital of Europe. And for American brands and Asian from the Far East, or even sort of South Asia, what you're finding is it's usually their entry barrier into Europe. So they'll set up their first one or two, or their flagship for Europe will be London. And then when they want to then branch out into other parts of Europe, they then do that off the back of their flagship, again, within a very prime sort of London area. Hopefully that continues. We've seen a huge demand and huge appetite for new brands, and there has been an influx with requirements sort of being higher than ever. However, it's always down to covenant. The estates that own, like the Crown Estate, Grosvenor Estate, they're obviously very particular. You've got to tick a lot of boxes to sort of even be considered. And we've seen an influx of new brands, and I think that's going to continue over the next sort of 5 years. What we're going to see is...
But just to answer the direct question, just in the last 20 seconds, do you think it's a matter for local authorities to actually intervene in creating the mix of shops or dictating the mix of shops?
The long and short of it is yes. I don't know how much they can dictate, but they would need to perhaps put a limit on,
Well, they can, for instance. I mean, I know down here in Canary Wharf, there's some of the streets surrounding the wharf where they'll say there's a school nearby, so there will only be no more than 2 fast food outlets, for instance, or only one sweet shop or whatever else. And I think it's quite constructive, actually.
And I think having no more than 3 or 4, because then when you're attracting people or tenants in an environment like that, what you don't want is somebody coming in for a year or 2 years, setting up, obviously their fit out costs, so on and so forth, paying that rent, but then within 3 years they've got another 10 competitors. It's going to be a very difficult market, and I think the government also have to step in, and it's going to take maybe some sort of initiatives or some sort of incentives for, the boroughs working with government to attract those sort of brands and give the public what they want, rather than, like you say, a coffee shop every other block.
Okay, gents, thank you very much. So, to Zee Razaq, Managing Director of Certex Accounting. Thank you for coming in again, Zee.
Thanks, Stephen.
Vivek Brahmbhatt, Property Agent and partner of Robinson Marsh. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you
Great
very much.
answers from both of you. Really helpful. Thank you so much. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.